Moments ago, in an exclusive interview with CNN's Dana Bash, Trump's running mate, Governor Mike Pence, not only agreed with Trump's assertion last night that the president of Russia is a stronger leader than the president of the United States, but Governor Pence called Trump's claim inarguable. Pence also tried to clean up Trump's criticism of military leadership when he said this.
I think under the leadership of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, the generals have been reduced to rubble.
Dana Bash joins me now live from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library where that interview took place. Dana, did Governor Pence seem reluctant at all to repeat the assertion about the president of Russia being stronger than the president of the United States?
Jake, he actually didn't. And I asked him about that statement of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in the context of why Mike Pence was here at the Reagan Library to give a speech comparing Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump, both in terms of the eras and in terms of the men and their leadership. I talked about the obvious that Ronald Reagan stood up and called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and how that could, or it does it, compare to what Donald Trump is saying about Vladimir Putin. Last night, Donald Trump said that Vladimir Putin has, quote, been a leader far more than our president has been a leader. Do you share that view?
I think there's a great analogy between the time that Ronald Reagan was willing to name what was the greatest threat to the people of the United States, which was the communist Soviet Union. He called it an evil empire. And just a few short weeks ago in Youngstown, Ohio, Donald Trump, unlike President Obama and Hillary Clinton, was willing to name what is the greatest threat to the people of the United States today, which is radical Islamic terrorism. In the case of both men, they identified the signature threat of the time. They named it, they challenged it, and they developed a strategy to move against it.
But Governor, Donald Trump said that Vladimir Putin has been a leader far more than the President of the United States. Do you share that view?
Well, remember, Ronald Reagan spoke boldly on the world stage, even about the Soviet Union. But it was Ronald Reagan also who met with Gorbachev and demonstrated that you can, as Teddy Roosevelt said, you can walk softly and carry a big stick. You can speak boldly and plainly, but you can have relationships with people on the world stage.
Do you personally think that Vladimir Putin is a stronger leader than the current president?
I think it's inarguable that Vladimir Putin has been a stronger leader in his country than Barack Obama has been in this country. And that's going to change the day that Donald Trump becomes president of the United States of America. I mean, look, you've seen incidents in this last week.
I mean, I don't need to tell you because you were in Congress. Barack Obama has a true democracy here with the Congress that pushes back because there's checks and balances. Vladimir Putin doesn't have that.
That's exactly right.
So is it hard to say?
And Donald Trump said last night he doesn't particularly like the system.
While we're on foreign policy, I have to ask you, you mentioned last night that Mr. Trump said that the generals, quote, have been reduced to rubble under President Obama and Hillary Clinton. Do you agree with that? And is that how a potential commander-in-chief should speak about the military brass?
Well, I think the American people are deeply troubled at a foreign policy and military policy of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton that has caused the wider Middle East to literally spin out of control. We've seen civil war in Syria, civil war in Libya. We've seen entire areas of Iraq that were won by the American soldier be compromised.
Mr. Trump was specifically talking about the generals. The generals have been reduced to rubble. He wasn't talking about...
Dan, I actually think, in all due respect, I think he was talking about the commander-in-chief reducing the influence of generals to rubble. I think the truth is that the leadership that we have had at the top, and you heard Donald Trump talk about that last night.
Let me ask you about that in terms of plans. Mr. Trump also said last night that he has a secret plan to defeat ISIS, which he says he doesn't want to broadcast to the enemy. You are his running mate. Has he shared his secret plan to defeat ISIS with you?
Well, I'll keep our private conversations private.
But do you know, I mean, you don't have to tell me what the plans are, but do you know?
Well, what I can tell you is what he laid out yesterday, what he laid out in Youngstown, Ohio, is a plan to bring in military commanders within 30 days and to have their recommendations, including added to his thoughts and his ideas of how we can hunt down and defeat and destroy ISIS.
So you haven't seen
at its source. Well, as I said, I'm going to keep our private conversations private, but what I want to say to you is that what you're hearing Donald Trump say is that we're going to have leadership that is focused and determined.
Do you think that the military will be able to come up with a brand new plan to defeat ISIS that they haven't come up with under President Obama?
Well,
I mean, it sort of suggests a dereliction of duty by the military.
No, the military commanders serve at the pleasure of civilian authority. The commander-in-chief makes the call. And I'm confident that our military commanders can bring forward the ideas once the commander-in-chief makes the mission clear, which Donald Trump has made clear. And Dana, we have to do it. The truth is that
that could mean troops on the ground. If you really want to, go for it, you know what it takes. Are you and Mr. Trump willing to go that aggressively in a way that Mr. Obama just isn't?
Well, what I could tell you is that Donald Trump as Commander-in-Chief is not going to signal to the enemy what we will or will not do, as Hillary Clinton did last night on national television.
To anybody in the military who saw that and thought that he was being critical of the military, not so much, or in addition to the current president, what would you say? I don't
think they would take it that way. I really don't. And frankly, as I campaign around the country with Donald Trump and for Donald Trump, and I see the tremendous support we have among veterans and active duty military personnel.
You have really took it upon yourself to reach out to a lot of Republicans who you have really good relationships with, to talk about what's going on with the campaign, people who Donald Trump doesn't have a history with. Are you kind of the Trump whisperer at this point?
I don't even know what that means.
You try to translate what Donald Trump really meant to the people who are skeptical of what he's trying to do?
Yeah. Look, I'm incredibly honored to be standing shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump. And I have the privilege of not only knowing the policies, but getting to know the man, getting to know his family. This is a good man who will be a great president.
And do you find when you have these private conversations with skeptics that because you talk to him on a daily basis, that you have success in explaining what he's really trying to say or trying to do?
Well, I've had a number of very warm conversations with leaders around the country, and more Republican leaders and independents and many Democrats are being drawn to this campaign.
Now, Pence also told me that he will release his tax returns by the end of the week. Jake, that means, of course, tomorrow. And also, I asked him about his own debate prep. Donald Trump has said that he is not doing a traditional prep with a stand-in for his opponent. Mike Pence told me he is. He has somebody who he's doing mock debates with who is playing Tim Kaine, who he will be debating at the beginning of October. Wouldn't tell me who that is, but he said he is taking this very seriously because he says he feels it's important to do right by Donald Trump at this debate. Jake.
All right, Dana Bash, thank you so much.